You see, something's going to happen.
What? What's going to happen?
Something wonderful.
What?
I understand how you feel. You see, it's all very clear to me now.
Welcome to the Occult Rejects. Very happy to have back this returning guest. The last few episodes, he has definitely killed it, I think, in information and bringing proof and receipts of what he's talking about. And today, as usual, I got the Occult Reject mad scientist herself, Liza, with me. What is going on, Liza? How are you?
Very well. Doing well. Looking very forward to this. I've been looking forward to it all week.
Yeah, we unfortunately had to book him like a couple of weeks in advance, so we knew this was coming. So we're like, I can't wait.
Yes. And he's been throwing fire out on Twitter too. So
yes.
It's been really, really good. Yeah.
All right. So in case new listeners, please let everybody know what you do.
So I, about 19 months ago, I started a website called LDS Abuse. And I was really just looking to do a little bit of research on like sexual abuse in the church and helping people understand how to navigate that process of dealing with ecclesiastical abuse. And as I started that project, it just kind of has been mushrooming. And as you guys know, as we've talked about in our last couple interviews, it really led down some places of understanding what I think I want to start calling LDS Inc., right? I read a really great book, I didn't read the whole book. I started reading a really great book yesterday about Operation Gladio and how the Vatican was tied in with the CIA and all that. And we're going to talk just a very little bit about this today. But this author talks about Vatican Inc., and I love that formulation of what he's saying. And I think that there's really an LDS Inc. that's very similar to Vatican Inc., right? And I'm going to show you how that ties in today with what we're going to cover. But today is mostly all about Russell M. Nelson, because Russell M. Nelson is having a birthday in 3 days. Happy birthday, Russell M. Nelson. He's going to be 100 years old, right? And so, yeah, he's going to be 100, right? So pretty big deal. And, they're doing a big push on Twitter with the 99+1 campaign. But I want to use this opportunity to prove out something that I've been saying in these other interviews, which is that anybody can say anything, but actions reveal intent. And I want to do that by kind of looking at Russell M. Nelson's life and what most people know about Russell Nelson's life, because that's what they're told, versus what actually happened in Russell Nelson's life, that I think shows some intent that I don't know, might be concerning to some people. It was certainly concerning to me, and was one of the major things that kind of, I think, pushed me out of the church eventually. So with that being said, whenever you guys are ready, Nick, we can throw up the first timeline, and we'll just get rocking and rolling here.
Let's do it.
All right. So this first timeline, I have several today. This first timeline is, we're going to go through it really fast and I just called this timeline, Anyone Can Say Anything, the life events of Russell Marion Nelson. And the reason I called it that is that if you were to go Google, in fact, this timeline is generated by artificial intelligence. So the software that I use to create these timelines has the ability to say, go out and research a subject and give me back all the items that you can find on this to include in the timeline. So this is completely generated by artificial intelligence. So for those of you who know about artificial intelligence, like it's a big thing that's going on right now, and a lot of people are beginning to use it to like do their term papers. They're using it at work to do shortcuts. And I want to kind of show you one of the dangers of that, because here's what you would get if you ask for the life events of Russell Marion Nelson from artificial intelligence. So not that any of it's not true. As we'll see, it's all true. It's just not the whole story. So if you were to ask artificial intelligence to give you the life events of Russell Marion Nelson, you would see that he was born on September 9th, 1924. You guys might remember that he was the first child born that was like his sister, his older sister, his mother became pregnant before they were married. And so Russell was the first child born post-wedding to Marion Clavara Nelson and his wife on September 9th, 1924. And we're only 3 days away from the 100th anniversary of that birth. Russell M. Nelson certainly was married to Dancel White on August 31st, 1945. I actually added this in, and I'll talk about this when we get over to my second timeline. But so you would learn that Russell Nelson was married in August of 1945. That's true. He graduated with a bachelor's degree and a doctor of medicine degree from the University of Utah in 1945 and the University of Minnesota in 1947. He did do some research on the heart-lung machine and was the first person to perform a pediatric cardiac operation in March of 1956. So really good stuff there. As we've said before, Mr. Nelson is certainly a brilliant individual who can speak many languages and was an accomplished heart surgeon. So we're all good there. He was elected as the president of the Society for Vascular Surgery, so very accomplished in his field. He became a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on April 7th, 1984. Became the Quorum president on 2015. Looks like I have a duplicate here. That's my fault. And then became the church president, the president of both the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is the corporation based out of Utah, and at the same time became the president of the Global Christian Faith that goes by the same name, which we'll probably talk a little bit about that because there's some weirdness and wonkiness about why a global faith and a Utah corporation both have the same name. That's not an accident, I don't think. Once he was president, he's done a lot of things. He created a new unified hymn book. He put an emphasis on the church's full name and asked people to stop calling us Mormons and asked us to stop as Mormons to stop calling ourselves Mormons and put an emphasis on using the church's full name, which is a mouthful. He shortened Sunday meetings. He adjusted a bunch of church policies and then readjusted them again and adjusted them some more and on and on and on. Then he was able to get a temple in Rome, Italy in March of 2019, which is amazing and true. He met with Pope Francis right around that same time, issued a new proclamation, which many members of the church would consider scripture, although I think officially it's not considered scripture, but he was in charge of issuing a proclamation on April 5th, 2020, reaffirming some of the basic doctrines of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And then one of his major things that he's done during his time as president is announcing a lot of temple construction. I think, if I remember right, the number here was like 168 temples. So if you were a curious individual who knew nothing about Russell M. Nelson and you asked artificial intelligence or your average Mormon to give you a background on the life events of Russell Marion Nelson, this is what you might be told, right? But you have to remember that anyone can say anything, but I'm going to switch over to another timeline here real quick.
Okay, so.
Okay, that should be ready. All right. So anyone can say anything, but actions reveal intent. And sort of the overall thrust of what I want to share with you guys today and the audience is that when you look at Russell M. Nelson's life and you look at the actual documented events, it's not exactly the story that you're told by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or by artificial intelligence or by your friendly Mormon neighbor who wants you to join the church and pay 10% of your income for tithing to the corporation. There's a little bit more that goes on, and that's true of everybody, right? But I think it's a significant enough difference between what you're presented and what actually went on that I think it's important that we all take a look at it, especially because Russell M. Nelson is out in the world preaching that there are 15 men on the face of the earth that you can trust completely. And so here I have a screenshot of a talk that he gave, and it's still posted on YouTube as of yesterday. I don't know how long it will be posted if the church gets wind that this is out there on YouTube, but for right now, it's still out there, and I have a link to it if anybody wants to go watch. And in this talk, Russell M. Nelson teaches that there are 15 men on the face of the earth today, and you can trust them completely. And by those 15 men, he means himself and the other members of the First Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and then the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And that is an extraordinary claim. To claim that there are 15 men that you can trust completely is it would be amazing if there were 15 men that you could trust completely. And if you could just sort of turn over your decision-making abilities to them. And when they came out and said, be a good global citizen and get the literal God-sent COVID-19 vaccine, if you could just trust them completely and know that everything was going to be okay, well, life would be a lot easier for people like Justin Riggs, because I would love it if people would make decisions for me that I could trust completely. Unfortunately, I don't trust them completely. And I find it really problematic that Russell M. Nelson is out there preaching this doctrine to my brothers and sisters in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because I know many people who do trust them completely. And my message today, as a birthday present for Russell M. Nelson, is to tell them they should probably think twice about trusting anybody completely, including Russell M. Nelson and including Justin Riggs. Like, if you trust me, then you're crazier than I am. So let's take a look at some of the events that we've documented about Russell Marion Nelson's life, so that people can make wise decisions for themselves and their families about whether or not they should trust him and his 14 brethren completely. But really, we're going to focus on Russell M. Nelson mostly. So he was definitely born on September 9th, 1924. And then in his autobiography, he writes about his childhood. And what he writes about is ditching church. And I actually find this kind of charming, to be honest with you. I don't believe in leaders who are perfect, and I don't believe in human beings who are perfect or present themselves as perfect. And so, just to be really clear, this is one of my favorite parts of Russell Marion Nelson's book, which is called From Heart to Heart. He says, ultimately, I found it was more interesting and enjoyable to leave home in my Sunday clothes as if I were going to Sunday school, and then to divert my course from church to nearby Harvard Park at the corner of Harvard Avenue and 13th East. There, I was able to play football with other youngsters. We carefully noted the time, knowing we could get together shortly after 10 o'clock and play until about 11:30. Then we would have to put ourselves back together again and walk home as if we had been to Sunday school. I think my parents often wondered why I came home so dirty and sweating from my Sunday school experience. So the first thing to understand about Russell Marion Nelson is that as a child, he was not going to primary. He was not going to Sunday school. He was practicing his football skills, and apparently that didn't work out. And so he became a heart surgeon instead, which, as most young men in America know, this is what we would rather be doing on Sundays anyway. So like I said, I find this kind of endearing. And I like to picture Russell M. Nelson playing linebacker on Sundays while he's supposed to be learning about the Book of Mormon. I think it's kind of fun. So the next thing on the other timeline is talking about his marriage to Dancel White. And that's certainly true. He did get married to Dancel White. The church will present Marion and Dancel as, sort of model members of the church, and that's fine and well. But in his own book, he has a picture of Dancel in clothing that I know for most people isn't shocking at all. But for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who have to wear a temple garment that covers, especially up top, it's like a t-shirt, really. But to see Dancel White in Russell Nelson's book in spaghetti straps and something that looks like what most Mormons would consider lingerie, I think, might be a little bit shocking, right? And so we have to just remember that, like, while the church might want to present them as model members, and maybe they were later on in life, I don't really know. I never knew Russell or Dancel Nelson. But at this stage in her life, Dancel was certainly not in conformity with LDS dress standards. And the other thing about this that I really want to point out, and it's going to be important a little bit later on, is that the person who married Dancel and Russell Nelson was a man by the name of Nicholas Grosbeck Smith Sr. And I'm going to just kind of leave that out there dangling for people right now, but just remember that name, because it's going to be really illuminating, I think, to see how Russell treats people that are an important part of his life. I mean, this is the person that they asked to marry them. And what we're going to find out is that the grandchildren, am I going to get this right? The grandchildren of Nicholas Grosbeck Smith actually are part of the abuse ring in Bountiful that Russell M. Nelson covers up. So hold on to this name, Nicholas Grosbeck Smith, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more later on. So in our Anyone Can Say Anything timeline, on the education tab, it certainly talked about his degrees and his accomplishments. What artificial intelligence failed to tell us, and what like no Mormon will ever tell you, is that Russell Marion Nelson is a death oath making man. Right now, I'm not going to go too much into this, like from the religious point of view, although I think that pretty much anybody who's a Christian understands that the Bible tells us not to make oaths, right? Especially death oaths. And so I think it's really important that if Russell Nelson is going to claim that he can be trusted completely, that he at least like tells us that he made death oaths with organizations like Sigma Chi and Skull and Bones, right? Now, I don't know anything about the oaths that he made with Skull and Bones, or if there even are any oaths with Skull and Bones, because Skull and Bones is really good at keeping that stuff under lock and key, right? With Sigma Chi, however, the Sigma Chi oath was leaked by WikiLeaks several years ago. And so I know a lot about the oath that Russell Nelson made, as well as the fact that he participated in something called the Black Supper and all kinds of other things that I'm sure that Sigma Chi would rather I not know about the way that they go about their business. So in this case, I just want to read something that comes directly out of the document that WikiLeaks published related to Sigma Chi and its oath. So in the paperwork, it says, the appearance of Constantine. So in their ceremony, they're doing role play, they're cosplaying, right? And they have literally somebody dressed up as the Emperor Constantine, and Constantine for Sigma Chi represents their patron saint. You can find that language inside of other documents online. And so when it says the appearance of Constantine, what they're talking about is during this initiation ceremony, a young dude will dress up in a toga, I guess, or a robe, and he'll represent Constantine. So it says, the appearance of Constantine serves to unite the death thesis that entered into our ritual several years earlier, and the heritage behind the white cross and in hoc signo vinces. I don't know how to say that. Sorry, Sigma Chi guys. I don't know how to say your stuff. In 1870, an 1870 revision of the ritual provided that the emblems of mortality, which is going to be what? Skull and bones. That's what the emblems of mortality are. Be displayed at the consul's station. So the consul is the head of the fraternity for that year. And they have a station, and they're going to put the skull and bones, the emblems of mortality, and Constantine is going to swoosh out and give a wonderful speech to inspire all of the new initiates. It says, thus to be in full view of the candidate as he was obligated. The 1870 revisers of the ritual were apparently aware of the common ritualistic practice of having a death thesis, in that when a man takes an oath of lifelong duration, he must recognize that death will eventually come. So this isn't peculiar to Sigma Chi. I mean, all of your fraternities are going to have a death thesis and death oaths. The problem for me is that as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who attended many, many temple recommend interviews, I was often asked whether or not I had made such oaths. And I was told that if I had made such oaths, that I wouldn't be allowed to enter into the temple. And I'm not going to go too far and too deep into this, but let me just lay out sort of the general idea here. In the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there's been a lot of commingling with occult groups, including Freemasons, which we've talked about, and now fraternities. And one of the results of that was that for a very long time, the official policy and procedure of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was to not engage with any of these types of organizations, including during the time when Russell M. Nelson was joining Sigma Chi and Skull and Bones. Now, I guess people could argue that Russell Nelson didn't know that he wasn't supposed to be doing this, but because he was ditching church, right, as a youth. So maybe he never got the word that he shouldn't be doing this. I'm not really sure, and he won't answer any questions about it. So we're all going to have to form our own opinions about that. But the fact of the matter is that you can see very, very clearly that in the official handbook of the church, it's very clear that you shouldn't be joining these types of organizations and making these types of oaths if you want to be a member in good standing of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, until this generation of people who were joining with Sigma Chi and Skull and Bones got into leadership positions inside of the church. And then in the 1967, I want to say, Handbook of Instructions, all of a sudden, all of the instructions about not joining these organizations goes away. It just vaporizes and disappears. And I actually have a physical copy of that Policies and Procedures Handbook that I found online and purchased just to verify that this is the case. So what it appears to me to be like is that these men who claim that they can be trusted completely were joining organizations that they knew they shouldn't have. They were lying on their temple recommend interviews. And then when they came into power in the church, they just whitewashed everything about this in order to make it so that they could now answer these questions in a way that I guess maybe they could sleep at night. So let me stop there for just 1 second. Any questions so far, or any comments?
I have a comment. I think, Nick, you did a whole entire series about how you go all the way from bottom of Mason all the way to the Order of Quetzalcoatl, right? I'm probably saying that wrong.
Pretty much, yeah.
And that there is some sort of association, bridge, or affiliation with Mormons. Like, you do see some of the Mormon participation in some of this Freemason activity. Not that all of them, just you do see some sort of association. Let's go with that. And you see it with most of Christian religions. But when you talk about a death cult, Justin, it reminds me, and we talk about Quetzalcoatl, it reminds me of the whole death thing associated with the Mayan and Aztec religion. And you see enormous amount of, presence of Mormons in Mexico, all the way down from Central to South America. And most of those cultures do heavily believe in that, Teresa said perfectly in the comments, memento mori. I mean, it's almost like it's a reverberation, an echo from all of that as well. Do you think that would be something true?
I mean, I didn't come prepared to discuss this, but as you're talking, I'll tell you what's interesting to me. No, not at all. Not at all. I'm happy to, because here's why I like the fact that you brought it up. So one of the interesting things that you would see I've not done this research, but I can almost guarantee you that if I were to do this research, just based on my 45 years of experience in the church, is that what you would see is that as these men who joined these types of organizations gained prominence in the church, there's a really big shift, and there's a big battle in the church right now about where the Book of Mormon took place, because the church believes officially the church doesn't believe that it's a historical document, but we're culturally conditioned to believe that it's a historical document from the time that we're born. And there's a really big battle going on in the church right now about where the Book of Mormon took place. And the two models are called the Heartland model and the Mesoamerican model. And Joseph Smith was very, very open about the fact that he felt that at least part of the Book of Mormon took place in North America. But as you get these Sigma Chi and fraternity guys who are making these death oaths with these other organizations, what you'll see is that they throw all of their weight behind the idea of the Mesoamerican model, right? And I don't know why that is, but listening to you talk, it makes me wonder if shifting the focus down to Mesoamerica has something to do with this that I'm not aware of, right? But I mean, you can find books at Deseret Book that will talk about Quetzalcoatl, right? And the way that they'll present it is that was Jesus Christ coming down into Latin America and teaching people the gospel of Jesus Christ. And they believe that that's where the Book of Mormon took place. So it's kind of a fascinating connection.
And the fact that you say that, and I'm not deviating, and we'll get back to what you're saying. One of the main beliefs with Toltec, Aztec religions, Mestiza and all that other stuff, was that the legend was that Quetzalcoatl was somewhat of a Jesus figure. And that when he left, he told them he would come back. And when he would come back from the east. And he was the only man present among them that had facial hair. And that and he was light-skinned with colored eyes. And so when the Spanish came, they assumed that was Jesus because they all had facial hair, light-skinned and colored. And so that's what so when you kind of tease it all out and unpack it, it was a Jesus figure to Mesoamerica when the Spanish came. And so when you say that Quetzalcoatl is Jesus, that if you kind of bullet point it out and compare and contrast, that's pretty much the same thing.
Yeah. So for those people who are interested in this topic, there are two scholars I can point you towards that I know, and I actually have spoken with both of them personally. So one of them, and you can't talk to one of them because he's no longer with us. John Pratt is very big on the Mayan calendar and tying that to other sacred calendars. And there's still a website out there called johnpratt.com where people can sort of see what a practicing Mormon believed about this. And John ended up leaving the church eventually, or I don't know if he actually officially left the church, to be honest with you, but he ended up going a different direction at the end of his life. But he was he has a PhD in astronomy, and he talked a lot about this Quetzalcoatl Mormonism connection. The other person that people might want to look into, and I may get this name wrong, but I believe it was Garth Norman, if I remember right. And he talks a lot about a place down in Mexico called Izapa. And again, I'm probably not pronouncing that correct, but this is a society that you talk about the beard, and he found some stela that had figures that had beards coming across on the ocean, which is sort of a part of the story of the Book of Mormon, where you have Lehi, who's an Israelite, escaping from Jerusalem and coming across the ocean and landing somewhere, we don't know what. But what Garth Norman was proposing was, well, maybe they landed in Izapa, right? So for those people who are interested in those topics, you can look up those names. And John and Garth were both really, really nice guys. They took time to answer a lot of questions that I had, and I find their work really fascinating. So yeah, that's a really great tie-in. So that's a great comment.
Okay, sorry about that.
No, I want to
Yeah.
actually kind of like piggyback off of something Lisa was saying. Like even when I went to go to Skinwalker Ranch many moons ago, that's when I even came across anything with really Mormons. And that's when I started like looking into them a lot, and I started to notice that there was even like different types of like kind of beliefs among them about like, I guess if they came up through Mexico or if they came down through like Canada into the United States. But there was like one group, and these were like I don't know if these are like, I don't know how to say, like splinter groups or just small groups of people that happen to have a completely different look than the rest of the Mormons. But there was even. What I'm getting at, like, there was even like tours that was specific for Mormons to be going to the Quetzalcoatl pyramid in Mexico.
Yeah, major
because
cottage
they
industry.
believed that Quetzalcoatl was Jesus.
Yeah. There's a major cottage industry inside of Mormonism where people will take you down into the ruins of Mexico or up into upstate New York, or and then there's an entire group of Mormons who are on cruise ships giving lectures about Jesus in Jerusalem. And it's a thing for sure. You're absolutely right about that. And and to sort of address, Mormons as a group are not as monolithic, I think, as outsiders believe, right? There's a lot of freedom to believe what you want to. Where you're going to get yourself in trouble is if you try to gather up groups to follow you based on a belief where the church doesn't feel comfortable answering a question, which kind of begs the question, look, if you have prophets, why don't we know where the Book of Mormon took place? But that's a whole different topic that we could spend a lot of time on. But yeah, no, you're right. There are a lot of different beliefs about these types of things. But for sure, as this group of death oath making men come through college and then rise into prominence inside of the church, the Mesoamerican model is the one that sort of gains favor, right? And the church has never come out officially and stated that they think that the Book of Mormon took place down in Mesoamerica, but there's sort of a wink, wink, nod, nod amongst the academia, and look, if you go to BYU and you want to get a job studying like where the Book of Mormon took place, you need to be part of the Mesoamerican camp. You're not going to get a job as a Heartland scholar necessarily, right? So all the money and the power is thrown behind this idea of the Book of Mormon taking place down in Mesoamerica. All right. Anything else? Any other questions or comments?
That was good. That was great. I love that tie-in. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks for bringing it up. Okay, so, we hear about Russell M. Nelson's graduation with his bachelor's degree at Utah in 1945. And I wouldn't expect artificial intelligence to come up with this necessarily, because as intelligent as they want to make it seem, it's not really that intelligent. But I found something that I think is interesting and just needs to be addressed. I want to be really clear that I don't know for sure. No, that's not the right way to say that. I have no evidence that Russell M. Nelson was involved in this, but I think that the fact that he was at the University of Utah in the years that he was, based on what I found, is something that might be something that we want to talk about as we talk about who we should trust. So here's what I found. As I was researching these years of Utah history, I found out that in Utah, there was a major eugenics program. And that program went for almost 60 years, 50 or 60 years. And there's a really good paper written about this. And it's pretty alarming what went on out there in Utah. But it just so happens that the peak of the eugenics craze in Utah happened right around the time that Russell M. Nelson was there at the University of Utah as an undergraduate student. And then he also went and got some medical training at the University of Utah before he went to the University of Minnesota to get his actual doctorate. So here's what it says. The institutionalized program peaked in Utah in the 1940s and didn't end until 1974. Utah had a particularly aggressive sterilization program. Eugenics leaders, in fact, hailed Utah for sterilizing a far greater proportion of its residents than any other state in 1947, which is just a couple years after Russell M. Nelson graduated from the University of Utah, as a, quote, important achievement in public health, end quote. So first of all, let's just talk about this eugenics program really quickly. And then let's talk about Russell M. Nelson and why I think we might want to discuss this, right? As we're trying to decide whom we should trust. So the eugenics program itself is really alarming in a state where the predominant religion is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which teaches about eternal families and teaches that the ability to have children is the greatest blessing that anybody can enjoy on this earth. To be participating in a eugenics program is already a little bit of a red flag, right? The fact that Utah had a particularly aggressive sterilization program, kind of as an ex-Mormon, makes my heart sink into my stomach a little bit. Because what I realize is what I've been told about Utah, that they're there to establish Zion. Like, I have to start asking questions like, well, what part of sterilizing people helps establish Zion? And why are the legislators in Utah for 60 years passing laws that allow for, look, I don't have the data here, but I'm guessing that there are a lot of Mormon doctors involved in this, right? And I also imagine that a lot of the people who were sterilized were Mormon people. In fact, in the article that I found, it specifically mentions a young woman who went to her religious leader. It doesn't say that it's a leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but just statistically, it's most likely going to be a leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She told this religious leader that she had been sexually abused by a man. And instead of helping her, this religious leader committed her to a mental institution, had her diagnosed as an imbecile, and then they sterilized her, only to turn around later and confess that she was most likely a sex slave who was being sold into the sex trade by whomever this man was that she had accused of sexually abusing him, right? Now, there's a little bit of work to do on that because for whatever reason, they choose not to disclose what religion this religious leader was from. But Utah's like 90% Mormon, right? Or was. It's not anymore. It's not anymore. But at this time, it definitely was predominantly Mormon. And so I think it's a reasonable thing to conclude that this was likely a Mormon girl who was being trafficked by a Mormon person who went to a Mormon leader and ended up getting sterilized for trying to get help, right? So the other thing that really bothers me about this is that the article talks about how many other states participated in this, but many of these states have since then taken the initiative to, at the very least, apologize officially, right? And some states have even gone so far as to create programs to give compensation to the people whose rights they violated. But Utah has never even acknowledged this program publicly, nor have they ever apologized or offered restitution. And there are still people who are alive, that's the whole study, this whole paper that was written about this, is about how many people are likely still alive that were sterilized in this program. So again, for those who aren't members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, this may seem a little bit pedantic, but like, I grew up being programmed and culturally conditioned to repent when I make a mistake. And repent just means to rethink, right? Pent, P-E-N-T is French for pense, to think. So it means to rethink, right? And then change your life. But as is true of so many things that are related to these men that Russell Nelson claims that you can trust completely, and that entire aristocracy of Utah Mormons, they don't repent. You know, they were involved in the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and it took them 100 and something years to say, I'm sorry, right? They sterilized a bunch of people for 60 years, and they won't even acknowledge that it happened.
Right.
So the hypocrisy there for me, and this is also just the Justin Riggs thing. Like, I mean, I have a particularly strong sense of justice around these things, and so I don't expect other people to be as outraged as I am about it. But I'm pretty outraged about what I learned about eugenics in Utah, and the fact that these Mormon legislators and these Mormon leaders refuse to acknowledge what happened or repent, right?
Yes.
So as far as Russell Nelson goes, I want to be very, very clear. There's no evidence that Russell Nelson participated in this eugenics program. That might just be because I've only had 24 hours to look into it, though. Here's what we can say conclusively. Russell M. Nelson was involved in the medical community in Utah at the very time that Utah was actively and aggressively participating in sterilization programs. He was receiving medical training at the University of Utah at the time that this program was going on. And I don't think it's that, like, I don't think we have to jump too far to surmise that at some point in his training, he may have been trained how to sterilize a human being, right? Mm-hmm. Now, again, zero evidence that occurred. And I will also say in his favor that in the paper, it talks about the locations where this was taking place. And it seems to be down a little bit further south in Utah, in like Provo, Utah. So there's a decent chance. And in fact, I'd say there's a better than average chance that Russell Nelson never participated in the eugenics program explicitly. But I do think that now that we understand that eugenics program was in place right at the time that Russell Nelson was at the university, it certainly opens it up as a topic of discussion and research for us to look a little bit more closely into. Especially when you realize that part of Russell Nelson's PhD was killing puppies by pumping them full of paracolon bacilli, right? So this isn't the easiest paper in the world to find, but if you look, you can dig up Russell Nelson's graduate work and the papers that he wrote. And what you'll see is that this is what he was doing. He was trying to figure out a way to start and stop the heart. He was trying to figure out a way to improve, to create a machine that would allow you to bypass the heart while you were performing surgery on it, so on and so forth. And I'm not going to get too much into it because I don't know enough about it and I'll look like an idiot. But I can look at a diagram just like everybody else can look at a diagram, right? And I can read tables of data just like anybody else can, and I can read papers. And what's really clear is that the part of Russell Nelson's career that they don't want to talk about from the church PR standpoint is that part of Russell Nelson's research was involved killing dogs, right? And I say puppies, and maybe that's not fair. Maybe I'm being a little bit sensationalistic about that because I don't know how old they were, right? What I know is that he was killing canines in order to do his research. So we know that he's not against killing living things in order to gain new knowledge. And I don't know, it's probably not fair to say that people who kill puppies are going to make that jump to being willing to participate in eugenics experiments. But I certainly think that it's a precondition, right?
It's an inclination for sure. You do have to make the jump on some level mentally that this is what you're going to do and this is how you're going to pursue it. And if you decide that that is not something you want to pursue, then you don't go into a field like that, because you don't just all of a sudden show up on the first day of lab and said, well, this is your experiment today. No, you are in the university. You know what's going on. You hear of different programs. You go and intern or kind of like view different laboratories, and you decide, you know what, I still want to go into heart medicine, and I'm going to pursue this professor to do my undergrad, to do my graduate work, and you already know what the grant is. You already know what's going on. This isn't just you show up one day and they put this on you and it's your job and that's it. No, you know these things are happening prior to. But one of the things that I wanted to mention before I forget, and me and Teresa seem to be feeding off of each other, is that we talked about this in the last previous episode, is that it seems like some of these ideologies early on are so Nazistic. And I'm not saying they're Nazis, but the whole ideology is again echoed, it's reverberated into some of these practices that have been, the underbelly. And the other thing is that you said 1947. That is the year that all of that happened. CIA is coming on board. We're having the new creation of the Air Force. from the Navy, I believe. And so it's a very interesting year, and it's all happening on that side of the continent. So
yeah, I agree. And I mean, and so going back to what we've talked about in other episodes, I think what you have here is if my hypothesis stands up, to scrutiny, what you have is a group of people in the early, like the very late 1800s, but really around 1910, 1911, formulating a plan for how they want to see the development of the United States of America. And a big part of that is getting control of the Western United States. And so by 1947, you have sort of your first generation that has implemented those plans, and you have things like the CIA springing out, and you have things like, and of course, it's also just a time of really rapid change, like sort of like what we're living through right now, including this ability to perform surgery on a heart where you're bypassing the blood from the heart, right? So it's
yes.
And there's a much larger conversation about right and wrong of this, right? Like, so I know I had a conversation with somebody online about that, and they had a really good point, which is like, look, if Russell Nelson hadn't killed dogs and you needed heart surgery, how else were they going to figure this out? And like, I'm willing to concede that point, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's pretty hard to complain about Russell Nelson killing dogs in order to discover how to bypass the heart during a surgery if I need to go to the hospital and have heart surgery. So that's all well and fine, and I'm willing to concede that point. I'm not really even talking about that. What I'm talking about is more what you were getting at, Lisa, which is simply that it takes a certain kind of person to engage in that kind of behavior. And again, it's not a matter of good people or bad people, and I'm not even saying that it's like wicked or evil. I'm just saying that it helps us understand the man a little bit better, to understand what it was that he was doing. And can a puppy killing person grow up to be a prophet? Well, certainly. Like, I don't think there's anything that logically keeps us from drawing the conclusion that you could be the kind of person who kills puppies and participates in eugenics programs and then ends up being a religious leader. It's a bit of a tougher sell for a person like me than perhaps somebody who spent their life serving orphans, right, and feeding them, and then became a prophet. But I mean, in my standard works, at least, we have many examples of men who made really poor decisions and even very wicked decisions who then repented and became prophets. So my big problem with Russell M. Nelson is this. I see a lot of problematic behaviors in Russell Nelson's life. What I never see is a repentance story. What I would like to hear from Russell Nelson on September 9th is his life story. And I would like to hear him talk about the change of heart that he had from going from a church ditching, death oath making, puppy killing person to a holy and spiritual man that was prepared to lead a global Christian faith. What I can say conclusively is that after 24 months of research, I have zero evidence that there was a repentance situation with Russell Nelson. There's an ambivalence situation he talks about in his book, From Heart to Heart, where he says, after talking about joining Sigma Chi and Skull and Bones, he talks about his ambivalence towards that. But the interesting thing about the word ambivalence is that that's the word that the doctors used to use when they were diagnosing people with schizophrenia. Because what is ambivalence? Ambivalence is a strong set of emotions in both directions. Right? Mm-hmm. And so literally in the literature, you can see that when they were diagnosing people with schizophrenia, they would say this person is ambivalent. And that just so happens to be the word that Russell M. Nelson uses in his own autobiography to describe his experience of making death oaths and joining with organizations like Sigma Chi and Skull and Bones. Now, I personally, when I'm looking for 15 people I can trust completely, I'm not looking for double-minded men. I'm not looking for people who are ambivalent about killing puppies and participating in eugenics programs and making death oaths. Like, I'm looking for somebody of one heart and one mind. And in my religion, I want that person to be aligned with my true master, Jesus Christ, right? Right. So that's really where I'm coming at this from. Like, the fact that he was killing dogs as his research, like there's a wide variety of opinions that are acceptable about that, I think. But
Justin, I was going to say the other thing, he's a surgeon. So the ambivalence is almost criteria, because when you are in surgery, you are not supposed to have any emotion. Yeah. You just go with the procedure. And so that almost, to your testament of what you're saying, is paramount for sure.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. So anyway, I hope I'm being clear about this, because I do just want to make sure that everybody understands that I think there are some really good points on the other side of this argument. All I'm saying is that we should be having the discussion. So first of all, we should have access to the information, which the church works really hard to make sure we don't have access to the information. Second of all, we should be having the discussion so that each of us can make decisions and provide informed consent about whom we want to affiliate with, support. And then in the church, we have this word called sustain, which has a very murky meaning. And I dare anybody to try to get an LDS leader to define what sustain means. You're going to find out that there is no definition. It just means whatever the person you're talking to thinks it means. So, right. But I just want everybody to be able to make informed decisions and provide informed consent for themselves. And then especially for me, what's really important, seeing so many abuse cases in the church, is I want people to make informed decisions for themselves and their children until those children are old enough to protect themselves, right? Because what I see in my research is a lot of parents who check their brains and their consciences at the chapel doors and trust 15 men completely, and then end up with children who are abused, only to find out that that spiritual body, that spiritual family that they thought they were a part of, is really backed by LDS Inc. And once the abuse happens, you're no longer dealing with your spiritual family. You're now dealing with LDS Inc. And that is a hellacious nightmare. It's a hellacious nightmare. And so I want people to be able to make wise decisions so that if their child does get abused in an LDS congregation, which is going to happen, we're beginning to get back like results from data sets. So like, let me just take a second to plug a really great organization called Floodlit. Floodlit has been spending a ton of time and energy and effort to document all of the sexual abuse cases that they can in Mormonism. And it's very hard because they're a very small team, but they already have almost 900 cases with another 900 just sitting there waiting to be verified. And so, but the sample size is getting to be large enough that we're going to be able to start performing some statistical analysis on this. And just yesterday, I think it was, Floodlit came out, and I think it was Elon Musk that put up a graphic about the number per million of women who commit sexual crimes and the number of men who commit sexual crimes. And then there was a third part of that that we're not going to talk about. But Floodlit came and said, look, based on our data, we see that an LDS population is roughly equivalent to the general population. So I think that's actually good, because one of the major pushbacks you get from Mormons is that, oh, like, well, we're no worse than the rest of the world. And that's sort of their first like knee-jerk reaction. And I think we're getting to the point now where we can look at the numbers and say, you're right. An LDS congregation is no worse than any other place on the world for protecting your children or yourself from sexual abuse. Here's the problem. It's also no better. Okay? And if it's no better, then why aren't we holding our ecclesiastical leaders to the same standards as we hold our daycare providers? Nobody would ever take their children to a daycare provider and ask for the data on whether or not those people were trained properly to protect children and be told, no, you can't see that data. And to watch your children, you have to pay us 10% of your income. No person in their right mind would say, okay, sounds great. That's a wonderful deal. And all I'm saying is if it's no better in an LDS congregation than it is anywhere else, then perhaps it's time for Mormon parents to start engaging their intellect and engaging their conscience and stop trusting people completely and acknowledging the reality of what it means to be a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and to do everything it takes to protect their children from the things that we know happen because we have thousands of cases of it happening. And that's really the thrust of my work in a nutshell. It's like, it's not so much about the leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, although what they've done is reprehensible. What I'm really here for is to get parents to engage in their children's safety in a way that's reasonable and not simply check their brain at the chapel doors. And I know we're all tired as parents. It's hard being a parent. And we want there to be places in the world where we can just turn our brain off and turn our children over to a group of people that we can trust completely. But I can tell you with 100% certainty that if you do that in the Mormon Church, there is a chance, a statistically, it's not just a non-zero chance. It's about the same chance as any other group of people that you put your children with. You are going to end up regretting checking your brain at the door, because you're going to end up with an abused child And instead of getting help from the spiritual body, you are going to be fighting against a gigantic multi-billion-dollar corporation who will do anything to protect their brand. And your child being abused is a threat to the brand.
Perfectly
Does that make
said.
sense?
Yeah.
Perfectly said.
Okay.
Well said, sir.
All right. Let's keep moving. So around this time, Russell Nelson transitions into his religious service, and he's still a heart surgeon for a lot of this up until he gets called into the Quorum of the 12. But you can sort of see him transitioning, and a lot of it is that he's really become the heart surgeon for the church, including a really important surgery that he performed on Spencer W. Kimball, who's the prophet that we talked about meeting with the Khashoggi family in the 1970s. So Russell M. Nelson is still a heart surgeon, but he's sort of transitioning into becoming sort of like the surgeon, what do they call that in the government? The top surgeon.
General.
The Surgeon General, right. He sort of becomes the Surgeon General of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right? And at the same time, you've got Dallin Oaks, who becomes the Attorney General of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And we'll
Creating their own government.
Yeah, I think so. So, so to get started with that, though, in 1971, Russell Nelson gets called as the president of what's called the General Sunday School Board. And this is one of the more alarming things that we found, and I haven't completed my research on this, but what I can say at this point is that based on the list of people that Russell Nelson talks about that he called and that he oversaw in this General Sunday School Board, it appears that about 10% of the people on this Sunday School General Board have either been accused of or convicted of sex-related crimes. Okay. Jesus. So we haven't gone through the entire list yet. I don't know what the actual number is, but just and this was a really shocking thing for me because it was literally going into his book and looking at the list. And as I was going through the book, it sort of dawned on me like, oh, wait, I know that name. That's Bishop. He's the guy at the MTC who was allegedly sexually abusing female missionaries while they were training to be missionaries for the church. Oh, wait, that's my relative, Heber Woolsey, who certainly has some sexual allegations of inappropriate sexual behavior that are there, right? Oh, wait, that's Ron Pullman, who got caught soliciting a prostitute down in Salt Lake City while serving as the state president. Oh, wait. And without even doing any real research on this, by the time I was done, 6 out of 60 were people that I had already come across in my research that we know had issues with sexual sin or crime, right? Depending on, and some of it's only alleged and some of it is confirmed. But the fact that you have just by a glance, 10% of the people on that board being involved in sex crime is a huge red flag. And I hope that somebody comes in behind me here or that I get time to come around and do the actual research here, because there is the appearance that they may have created sort of a haven inside of the church for these type of people. And then the other thing that's really important for people to understand is that it was not just the General Sunday School Board, but if you'll remember, we've talked a lot about Gillum Advertising, which is where Russell Nelson's father was the president and was one of the most prominent members of the Salt Lake community. It also appears that there was a rather high number of people who had sex crimes alleged against them who are working for Gillum Advertising as well. And so this is to be expected. Like when you do this kind of research, you're going to find enclaves, right? What I think is surprising is that we may have found an enclave of sexual predators inside the General Sunday School Board of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, at least during the time period that Russell Nelson was leading the organization. I don't know anything about that board right now or who's on it or anything like that. But during this time, it appears that they may have been forming a safe haven for these types of people inside of the church to give them sort of the appearance of worthiness while they were in their free time committing sexual crimes, right? So one thing I do want to point out about this, and this is not big enough. Let's see if I can make it a little bit bigger. I just want to show, again, this pattern that we've identified of how this was working sort of on a mechanical level. So I did not make this graphic. I can't remember who did. I wish I could give credit to the person who did. It was somebody on Twitter that shared it with me. But this is an amazing graphic because here's what it shows. So as we talked about, Russell Nelson was a part of Skull and Bones. And then we talked about it in other episodes that once you're in Skull and Bones, you then automatically go to Allen Key. So what this is an article from the year that Russell Nelson was named to be part of Allen Key. And the two people that are circled, it's even color-coded, which I just love so much. So you got Russell Nelson as being one of the Allen key guys, and then you've got a guy by the name of Richard Warner, okay? Then years later, Russell Nelson writes his book From Heart to Heart, and in there is a picture of guess who? Russell Nelson and Richard Warner. And Russell Nelson had just made Richard Warner a Sunday school superintendent for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Okay? And so this is a perfect example of what I think was going on at a level that nobody understands, including myself yet. Like from an actual, like if we want to use the word know, as in like we have all the data showing how this happened, nobody knows the extent of this. But I've done enough research now to state that there is a very clear pattern of death oath-making men greasing each other's palms as they walked through life, including putting each other in positions of power inside the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And this is just a really specific, perfect example of how that worked. Okay. And then also, just to be clear, I know I just got done talking about people on that Sunday school board who had accusations of sexual impropriety. Richard Warner is not one of those people. I did do a little bit of research, and I don't see anything in his life, just for if his family or anybody comes across this. I worried when they call me and say, was my grandpa part of this? I just want to make it clear that as far as I know, Richard Warner doesn't have any allegations of sexual impropriety in his life. Okay, moving on. One of the problems that a lot of people have with Russell Nelson is it seems that he may have a pattern of embellishing stories. And this particular story is already sort of known out there, but I have a couple things to add for people that I think they might find interesting regarding this. So the way this works is that basically Russell Nelson tells a story about a time that he was on a plane where the engine blew up and the engine was on fire and he was certain he was going to die, but miraculously, as the plane was in a death spiral, the engine extinguished itself and the other engine fired up and they were able to land the plane. Wow. And it's actually what he uses as the excuse for why he wrote his autobiography midway through his life. He says, look, I had this near-death experience and I realized that I hadn't written down my history. And if something like that ever happens again, I want my family to know, which I think is another lie, to be honest with you, but I don't have any proof of that. But let's just talk about some things about this story, okay? Because I think this is actually rather hilarious. So you're probably not going to be able to see this, but so what happened is he told this story and then a group of researchers went out and actually found the logs, because of course if there's an airplane accident, there are going to be logs about that, right? There's going to be reports. They have to investigate. And so there's a group of researchers who went and found it out, and they basically claim that Russell Nelson is lying about this story. So it got to be big enough that a group by the name of Fair Latter-day Saints had to respond. Now, Fair Latter-day Saints is the apologist group that is sort of supposed to protect the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but they do a terrible job. They're really not the best academics in the world, and their arguments are embarrassing, frankly. And I mean, I have an email from Fair Latter-day Saints about Russell Nelson's Skull and Bones activity, in which they openly acknowledge that they don't care about the truth of the matter, but that they simply are there to debunk the idea that it's a problem that Russell Nelson joined Skull and Bones. That's the kind of people that we're dealing with. So this group had to address this problem with the plane fire story because it looked like, based on the reports, that Russell Nelson had lied about that. So here's what they have to say about it. They say, in 1976, Russell M. Nelson was in a small commuter airplane traveling from Salt Lake City to St. George. During the flight, the plane experienced engine trouble and rapidly decreased in altitude. President Nelson described the experience. Quote, I remember vividly an experience I had as a passenger in a small two-propeller airplane. One of its engines suddenly burst open and caught on fire. The propeller of the flaming engine was starkly stilled. As we plummeted in a steep spiral dive toward the earth, I expected to die. Some of the passengers screamed in hysterical panic. Miraculously, the precipitous dive extinguished the flames. Then, by starting up the other engine, the pilot was able to stabilize the plane and bring us down safely. Hooray! Okay, so that's Russell Nelson's version of the story. So Fair goes and they get the summary, or they get the reports too. Now listen to what the report says. Quote, the second incident occurred on November 11th, 1976, and I want people to remember that date, November 11th, 1976, involving a Piper PA-31 N74985. pilot experienced rough engine on scheduled flight between Salt Lake City and St. George. Remember the places, Salt Lake City and St. George. There were 3 passengers on board, it says. So remember, Russell Nelson says some of them screamed hysterically, but there was only him and 2 others on the plane, okay? Engine was feathered and precautionary landing made at Delta, Utah, per instructions in the company manual. Investigation revealed cylinder base studs sheared. As a result of occurrence, SkyWest changed the maintenance procedures by checking torque studs at each 100-hour inspection. No damage to aircraft. No injuries to crew or passengers, okay? Fair Mormon goes on to twist themselves in all sorts of knots. The mental gymnastics here are stunning. They would win an Olympic gold medal if there was a mental gymnastics competition. But they go on to just talk about how there maybe they didn't know, like there could have been a fire and there was no damage, or maybe there was damage, but they just didn't, blah, blah, blah. And people can go look at the article for themselves. But Fair Mormon tries to come out and just basically say, look, these could both be true. Like there could have been a fire and there could have been no damage. And they never address, well, like what really happened, right? Okay. So what I found in my research is a couple things that I don't think I've ever seen out there in public. And so are you guys able to see my screen again now that I'm back on the timeline?
Mm-hmm.
So you can see this letter, right? So this is a letter from November 19th, 1976. So 8 days after the accident where President Nelson supposedly almost died in a terrific, fiery plane crash, okay? This is from Spencer W. Kimball, the president of the church, to Dr. Russell M. Nelson at his old address. And listen to this letter. He says, "Dear Brother Russell, how pleased we are to learn of the honor that has come to you in your election as chairman of the American Heart Association's Council on Cardiovascular Surgery. We extend our sincere commendation. We are proud of you, blah, blah, blah. We esteem and commend you, Brother Russell, for the wonderful influence, blah, blah, blah. I am personally so grateful to you for the special courtesies and services, blah, blah, blah. May our Heavenly Father's choicest blessings be with you and with your lovely Dancel and your family, blah, blah, blah." So what's missing from the letter 8 days after Russell Nelson almost died in a fiery plane crash from the highest person in the church is any mention of a fiery plane crash and how grateful they are that the Lord delivered Russell Nelson so that he could go on and become the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right?
Yeah.
So you would think if this was the deal that Russell Nelson made it out to be, that there would probably be some mention of, we're so grateful that you survived that horrific experience, right? But we don't find that. There's also a small date discrepancy that I'm not going to talk about because I'm running a little bit not short on time, but I'm running behind where I want to be, where in his book, From Heart to Heart, Russell Nelson names the date as November 12th, which I think is probably inconsequential, right? The report calls it November 11th, and in the book, it calls it November 12th. So for those who are really hardcore conspiracy theorists, if they want to try to chase that down and understand why the dates are different, you can find the reference to the accident in Russell Nelson's autobiography.
11/11
Okay.
is interesting.
Yeah. Oh man, I have something about that, but I don't think I want to talk about it today. About numbers.
One quick
okay.
thing I wanted to ask, just real quick. I just wanted to get this out there because maybe
sure.
you'll know.
Yeah.
And I hate to be going back on something from earlier. It's another funny numbers thing with the date. Isn't it known that the Mountain Meadows massacre happened on September 7th to 11th?
Oh, I don't know.
And I always thought that was weird because that's 9/11 in Building 7.
Yeah, I don't know. I've never really looked into that Meadows massacre all that much.
Well, I just thought that whole situation is just very sketchy and weird. Like it doesn't seem to make sense.
Yeah, I do know. I mean, the only thing I really know about it is the only guy that ended up getting punished, basically came out and said that he was doing it under orders, so on and so forth, and that like they basically threw under the bus is my understanding, but I don't know.
They had a jury that originally couldn't find somebody guilty. And then, which is weird, is that they changed the jury out with an old Mormon jury, then put a Mormon up on stand, and then they convicted him.
That's an old Mormon trick. Joseph Smith used to do that when he would get charged with something.
Was he just taking the heat? Were you putting it on him anyway? It just looked very interesting. Because it's like, why would you set up an old Mormon jury to put one of your people in jail? You would think it'd be for a not guilty, but it was a guilty. So it's just like, that's weird.
Where he was paid to sit down for a little while.
Yeah. All right, sorry about that. I just wanted to ask because I thought it was a weird numbers thing.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see. So I'm going to go through this next part a little bit quickly because we've already talked about a lot of it, but I just want to point out that In February of 1984, we have the document from the CIA reading room that's a secret. It was labeled a secret until they released it, showing that the CIA met with officials of the Mormon Church at Brigham Young University and endorsed the mission of the CIA. And then they also discuss how the elders, which that's going to be your quorum of the 12, plan to meet and address any concerns about our recruiting effort and its possible undercutting of the church's image. So it's not that these guys didn't understand that this was going to undercut the church's image. They very well understood that their involvement with the CIA was going against the ideals of the church and that it could be a potential problem. And they just said they were going to meet about it. The one thing I do want to point out is this is when Jeffrey R. Holland, who is now an apostle and is like, what, second or third in line, I can't remember, to be, prophet. This was when he was the president of Brigham Young University, okay? So he facilitates this meeting at Brigham Young University and ends up as an apostle. But the thing that's important about that for today, I think, is simply that in February 1984, they deepened their ties with the CIA. And in April of 1984, Russell M. Nelson becomes a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, as does Union Pacific Dallin Oaks, right? Now, I don't have any direct evidence that there's a tie between the fact that the church endorses the mission of the CIA in February 1984 and that Russell Nelson and Dallin Oaks are somehow sleeper agents that get installed as Mormon apostles in the church. But I do just want to point out the closeness of the timing here of February 1984 and April 1984 of when these events happen. And then people can go to town doing their own research, trying to draw the line there. There are a lot of people who believe that particular installation of apostles has many troubling questions around it, because Spencer W. Kimball was very, very sick to the point where he wasn't really cogent most of the time. And the way that the official story goes is that Gordon B. Hinckley got a call late at night or something like that. And President Kimball was awake and aware enough to call President Hinckley over and say, these are the men I want to be the apostles, because in the church, the prophet has the right to call the apostles. So, but the official story has enough suspicion around it that some people question whether or not it was really supposed to be Russell Nelson and Dallin Oaks that were called into the Quorum of the 12 at that time. I don't have an opinion about that because I don't have any data about that, except that February 1984, they're deepening their ties with the CIA. April 1984, you get these two guys installed into the Quorum of the 12. Okay, let's keep moving. So in 84, he's called to the Quorum. And in 1986, something really, really bad happens to Russell Nelson and his family. His daughter, Brenda Miles, and his son-in-law, Dick Miles, get fingered as participants in a child abuse scandal in Bountiful, Utah. And so what we know now about this is that in April of 1986, a man by the name of David Hardy was asked by his brother, Ralph W. Hardy Jr., to take abuse cover-up instructions that were faxed from Washington, D.C., to President Nelson's office in the church office building and give those abuse cover-up instructions to Russell M. Nelson. We know that because David Hardy came forward and signed a declaration in a court case stating that he was the person who received the phone call asking if he would receive the fax and walk those abuse cover-up instructions over to Russell M. Nelson personally. And he testifies under the penalty of perjury that he did so. So we can read a little bit about that right here. This is from David Hardy's declaration, which I've linked to in the timeline. It says, about 2 to 3 days later, I received a call from an attorney in Washington, D.C., with whom I was very familiar. He asked me if I could do him a favor relating to a very sensitive subject involving one of the apostles. I obliged. This attorney asked if I would receive a letter via fax and hand deliver it to Apostle Russell M. Nelson at the church office building. That Elder Nelson would be waiting for it. When the fax came through, I read it. Curious of the contents, I recall the opening paragraph saying, "Dear Elder Nelson, I am so sorry this tragedy has befallen your family. This needs to be kept out of the public eye. I remember having my interest piqued because of the allegations I heard days earlier about Dick Miles," those allegations being child abuse and being part of a pedophile ring. So only 2 years into his apostleship, President Nelson gets this awful news that his daughter has been named as part of a pedophilia ring in Bountiful, Utah. And that Special Affairs Committee, which we've talked about a little bit, and I'm going to talk about here a little bit more, jumps into action and they start trying to sweep it under the rug, right? And Russell M. Nelson, by all appearances, participates in this cover-up, specifically there's a document that I'm just dying to get my hands on. And if anybody sees this and knows where this document is, I know the document exists. I just haven't gotten my hands on it yet. But I've been told by multiple independent sources that there's a document written by Russell M. Nelson instructing local leaders to not pursue any sort of discipline for his daughter, son-in-law, and Bill Karstensen as it relates to this, and using his position as an apostle of the Lord to tell people not to pursue justice in this case from a church perspective. There are open questions about whether he affected the Bountiful Police Department. I've never heard of any documents that would prove that. I know that there's a document out there that would prove that Russell Nelson put his thumb on local church leaders, including the son of a Skull and Bones member who was the stake president in Bountiful, Utah at the time, telling them not to pursue the case any further. So if anybody knows how I can get my hands on that document, I would really, really love to have it at some point. Okay, let's keep moving. So Ralph Hardy is part of the Special Affairs Committee. And I just want to point out again, as we talked about a little bit in other episodes, that at this time, the church has really moved into a place where they're doing some really weird things, like spinning up committees like the Strengthening the Church Members Committee and the Special Affairs Committee. And it's, Lisa, I heard you say earlier in the show that they are forming their own government, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that's exactly what's happening. And they're doing it under the guise of corporatism, right? And I think what they would say is, oh, well, we have the right, we have a corporation, and we're just forming committees to help us run our corporation. But what they're really doing is setting up a separate kingdom outside of what they're supposed to be setting up, which is the kingdom of God as religious leaders. And they're doing it because they think they're the best and the smartest and the most special, right? And so we end up in a situation where they do this, right? And so you get these weird committees like the Strengthening the Church Members Committee, which is basically a spy unit, right? And you get the Special Affairs Committee, which is a group that meets together that never keeps an agenda. They don't keep a record of the times that they're meeting, and they talk about things that are basically based out of Washington, D.C. The entire Special Affairs Committee is basically housed out of Washington, D.C. with communications into Salt Lake in order to protect the church's, again, brand, right? So here's an example, and just showing that Russell Nelson was a part of this Special Affairs Committee. And again, just to show you that like this isn't a one-off of Ralph Hardy sending a fax with abuse cover-up instructions. This is a very well-established relationships. And the way that we know that is through the memoirs of a woman by the name of Beverly Bruff Campbell. And I wish I could spend hours and hours talking about Beverly, but I don't have the time. But what you can see is in her memoirs, she leaves us a copy of a memorandum sent to Richard Lindsay, who is the father-in-law of Garrett Gong, who's a Mormon Council on Foreign Relations prophet, who was leading up the public relations department for the church at this time. And it's also sent to Elder Russell Nelson from Beverly Campbell in 1986, the same year. Okay. So the fact that Ralph Hardy reached out to Russell Nelson is no accident. And Ralph Hardy is most famous for a YouTube video that got leaked by Mormon Leaks, in which he talks about the need to put people in positions of power that are what he calls quote unquote church broke, right? Just meaning that they'll do whatever we tell them to. So what you've got here is a group of people who demand total allegiance and total obeisance, who have a promise not to tell attitude towards things that are going to hurt the brand, working with each other to shush away legitimate abuse investigations inside and outside of the church, right?
Justin, it's almost like if they, you know how with the reservations, with the Native Americans on their own reservation, how they have their own government, they have their own church, they have their own philosophies, they have their own, it's almost like trying to follow the same playbook.
Yeah, so huge topic there and again, I'm not really well versed in this, but what you're getting at is before Joseph Smith died, they spun up what was called the Council of 50. And this is around the time that Joseph Smith decides to run for president of the United States. And he actually gets a blessing, anointing him to be a king over blah, 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 all these things. So like, I can't go too deep into this, Lisa, because I'm not educated enough about it, but yeah. I think you're right on. And I think there's an open question as to whether or not the leaders in Salt Lake believe that they are outside of normal governance, right? And that they actually do have sort of a parallel government running out of Salt Lake with the expectation that at some point in future history, they will be given the keys to rule over all of the earth, but that they're kind of getting ahead of it by setting up this sort of parallel government that's outside of any of the revelations that govern the church, right? But that aligns with their belief of how things ought to be. I think that's a really good point. Yeah. So when I talk about Special Affairs Committee and special people, and I say it tongue in cheek, I'm only partway saying it tongue in cheek. And I want to just show you what I mean, because here's another letter from Beverly Bruff Campbell's memoirs. And it talks about, I'm going to start on the bottom and then I'll move to the top. This bottom part is a letter from Russell Nelson to Beverly Bruff Campbell and her husband, Arwell Pierce Campbell. And it says, I loved your references to premortal acquaintanceships. And then he even gives you the page numbers from the book that she wrote about premortal acquaintanceships. So let's stop here for just 1 second, because this term may not mean anything to people who aren't members of the church. So premortal simply just means before you came to this earth. And in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you have a premortal existence, you have a mortal existence, and you have a postmortal existence, right? So what he's saying here is what he's talking about is knowing people before they were born on this earth, a premortal acquaintanceship. He says, that is the way Dancel, so his wife, and I have always felt about the two of you, meaning Beverly Bruff and Arwell Pierce Campbell. Our friendship is deep, everlasting, and remembered from premortal scenes. Okay, so I'm going to slow down for just 1 second because I want everybody to understand what he's saying here. Okay, the language is very precise. What he's claiming is that he knew Beverly Bruff Campbell and Arwell Pierce Campbell before they came to Earth, and that they had a premortal acquaintanceship. And then the inference there is, therefore, us meeting in this life, everything that we do with each other has the stamp of approval from God, because we planned this all out before we came here, and now we're just executing the plan here on Earth. And I really believe that the vast majority of people who are involved in this Special Affairs Committee and the Strengthening the Church Affairs Committee and anything to do with church leadership have a deeply held belief about these premortal acquaintanceships. And it gives them an irrational sense of confidence about what they do on this earth, because they believe that they're simply executing the plans that were planned before they came here. Okay?
Yes.
The other thing that's really kind of yucky about this is that publicly, the church is very against this idea of premortal relationships, because what you ended up having is there was a movie called Saturday's Warrior that was put out. That's a Mormon movie in which a man claims to a woman that, and look, I'd never watched Saturday's Warrior. I'm going to get this a little bit wrong, so just bear with me. But the general idea is that there's a man who claims and a woman who believes that they had a premortal relationship and that they met each other on Earth and that they should get married. So what you end up having is a bunch of kids at BYU with kind of creepy boys going to kind of naive girls and saying, hey, I had a revelation that I knew you before this life and we need to get married. And then the girl's like, oh yeah, it's like Saturday's Warrior. So publicly, the church is very, I know, right? The thing is, it works, right? At least if you're at BYU. The thing is, the church publicly kind of poo-poos this idea, but when they're writing letters to each other privately, they're very open about the idea that they knew each other premortally, right?
Yeah,
now,
yeah.
I want to jump up to the top of this graphic because I want to give you a better idea of who Beverly Bruff Campbell and Arwell Pierce Campbell are. So I'm just going to point out the parts that are highlighted. So she's talking about Arwell's career, and he ends up working at a company called Dynelectron. Now, here's the thing. Dynelectron, if you were to Google that and look at the Wikipedia page for Dynelectron, what you'd find is that Dynelectron is one of the biggest contractors for the Department of Defense, who was founded by a Mormon apostle's great-grandson by the name of Richards, okay? They're also a very well-known CIA cutout that ended up having multiple cases of human trafficking documented against them. Now, the human trafficking, as far as I can tell, didn't happen while Arwell Pierce Campbell was working for Dynelectron, but Arwell Pierce Campbell is a very, very interesting character, okay? Arwell Pierce Campbell served in the military right around the 1940s. He came back to the University of Utah, but you can't find any record of him at the university. He marries Beverly Bruff Campbell, and he kind of has this like rocket ride of a life without really any reason that I can discern that he was like particularly competent at anything, okay? So there's also some problems with his backstory. So in her memoirs, Beverly Bruff Campbell talks about how Arwell Pierce Campbell wanted to be an air traffic controller. Okay, the problem with that is that Arwell Pierce Campbell was in an automobile accident as a child that severed his auditory nerve in one of his ears. And you cannot be an air traffic controller if you are deaf in one ear. She also mentions that in his other ear, he had troubles hearing. So there are some real problems with the cover story, right? They also end up buying land in Virginia, and the land that they buy literally backs up to Langley property. Okay, they build a huge house that they call the Embassy, where they entertain a bunch of foreign diplomats, right backing up to CIA headquarters. Okay, now I don't know a whole lot about real estate, but I would think that if you were going to buy something that backed up to Langley, Langley would likely know who you are, and they would want to know what you're doing at that property, because they don't want to get anybody too close to CIA headquarters for obvious reasons.
Exactly.
But the fact that Arwell Pierce Campbell and Beverly Bruff Campbell were allowed to purchase land backing up to Langley and then host a bunch of foreign dignitaries really makes me wonder what kind of operation was going on there at the Embassy owned by Beverly Bruff Campbell and Arwell Pierce Campbell. Because if you were the CIA and you did know who Arwell Pierce Campbell was, and you did want him to build a piece of property, to buy a piece of property and build a big house that backed up to Langley, and you knew he was going to be bringing diplomats there, what kind of technologies might you have that could help you as the CIA get information that you needed from foreign dignitaries under the guise of going to that house for religious purposes, really, right? Like the purpose of those meetings was for Beverly Bruff Campbell, who was the public relations director of the church, to make friends with foreign dignitaries. So she's bringing them to the embassy, under the guise of, hey, we just want you to get to know our church better. But if you're backed up to Langley, and we know that they have technologies that we don't know about, and this is in the 70s and 80s, I mean, you're close enough that there may have been some spying on foreign dignitaries going on at the embassy. And I obviously can't say that Arwell Pierce Campbell was part of the CIA, but I would be willing to bet that Arwell Pierce Campbell was a part of the CIA. And we have a FOIA request in with the CIA to try to find out whether Arwell Pierce Campbell was part of the CIA. Okay.
Well, Justin, you don't need to be part of the CIA to be an asset.
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. So there's one other thing about Arwell Pierce Campbell, and then I'm going to move on. But the thing about Arwell is that there's a joke in Beverly Bruff Campbell's book where he is with, it's Nelson, and I want to say that it's Elder Ballard and Elder Maxwell, who are kind of the three like usual suspects when you talk about church leaders being involved with the military-industrial complex. And I think they're on a trip to China, if I remember right, but it's their trip foreign. And these three apostles jokingly call Arwell Pierce Campbell the bag man. Okay. Now, that's right in Beverly's memoirs, right? And she's saying it, and I personally think, there are a lot of people who disagree with me. I tend to think that Beverly Bruff Campbell really didn't understand. I think she was being used, right? And I think her husband was actually the one that the church wanted to interface between the government and the church. And then what you'll find, though, is that Beverly Bruff Campbell was given her opportunity for like sort of the big screen by Shriver, right? Is it Eunice Shriver, I believe is her name, and Sergeant Shriver. And so she gets approached by them, and that's in the quote that I just had up. And so I'm getting a little bit off track here, but here's the general idea. And I'm trying to think if we're going to see it here later in the, I may have missed it. So because here's the thing. Oh yeah, I did miss it. So let's back up just one quick second. Before there was a Beverly Bruff Campbell, there was a David M. Kennedy. And I actually hadn't looked into David Kennedy at all, really, until yesterday, when I found this book about Operation Gladio. So for those who don't know, Operation Gladio was a CIA project in which they left behind troops after World War II in order to make sure that communism didn't overrun the world, right? So in other interviews, people can go back and verify this. I've said, look, for any major CIA operation, if you just look, you're going to find a major Mormon within 1 degree of separation related to that operation. And so I decided to test my own claim yesterday. And as I started hearing about Operation Gladio on Twitter, I said, well, let's go see if there was a Mormon that was associated with Operation Gladio. And sure enough, David M. Kennedy was not only associated with it, he is named in the book as one of like kind of a mystery character in this whole thing, because the author doesn't quite understand why there's a Mormon wrapped up in all this stuff that's going on between the Vatican and the Central Intelligence Agency. So here's what he says. Much of what is known about the sect comes from John Roche, a professor at Oxford University who left the order and broke his pledge of secrecy. So we're talking about secret societies, but he's talking about Catholic secret societies. Okay. In an essay titled The Inner World of Opus Dei, Roche writes, internally, it is totalitarian and imbued with fascist ideas, turned to religious purposes, ideas which were surely drawn from the Spain of its early years. It is virtually occult in spirit, a law unto itself, totally self-centered, grudgingly accepting Roman authority because it still considers Rome orthodox. By 1984, there's that year again, when the reparation was made, Opus Dei had become a $3 billion enterprise, controlling 600 newspapers, 52 radio and television stations, 12 film companies, and 38 news agencies. Prominent Americans who became affiliated with the movement included CIA Director William Casey, William Simon of Citicorp, Francis X. I don't know how to say it, Stankard of Chase Manhattan, and Sergeant Shriver, the person who gave Beverly Bruff Campbell her big break into national marketing work through Special Olympics. Okay. Now listen, so that's one connection. Second connection, David Kennedy, a continental Illinois, albeit a Mormon, became a conspicuous friend of the sect, since his bank was a leading shareholder of an Opus Dei bank in Barcelona. So here's the thing that really caught me off guard yesterday. This paragraph is about Vatican Inc., but it could just as easily be written about Mormon Inc. When you talk about a secret order who believes that and they're occult in spirit, right? Who is totally self-centered and grudgingly accepting of outside authority because it considers Salt Lake City Orthodox, right? But then they own newspapers, radio stations, film companies, and news agencies. That's exactly what LDS Inc. was doing at this time. Okay, so this is completely brand new, and so I can't draw any conclusions, but in reading this book about Operation Gladio, I think that the Mormon Church's involvement with the CIA had less to do with projects like MK Ultra, although it may have had something to do with that, and much, much more to do with Operation Gladio. Because the thing you need to understand is that Continental Illinois is based out of Chicago, and it was like the 6th or 8th largest bank in the United States of America, and David Kennedy, a Mormon, was the person in charge of Continental Illinois and interfacing with the Vatican and the CIA as they were setting up Operation Gladio. Okay, and he was also an incredibly powerful person inside the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In fact, he was one of the few people who never really took on an important, what they call a calling in the church. And I think the reason that he never had to really take on an important calling in the church is because his interface with the Vatican and with the CIA was so important that they couldn't really afford to distract him with anything church related, right?
Justin, I'm going to interject right here that I almost, and this is just gut feeling, I have no evidence to back this up, my claim. It almost seems like they sent these people to learn the tricks of the trade before they went down to South America.
Okay, so yes, Operation Gladio, part of Operation Gladio is Operation Condor. And Operation Condor is the application of Gladio principles to South America, specifically Argentina. And the entire reason that this book got written is because it implicates this Jesuit Pope, whatever his name is. What's the Pope's name? Anyway.
My train's passing by, but it's Francis, but...
Yeah, that's it, Pope Francis. And Berkeley something, I don't know how to pronounce it. But what this book is claiming is that he was a bishop in Argentina at the time, and that he was participating with the CIA and turning over Catholics to the government to be tortured in Argentina, right? And so now, of course, I mean, what you're going to see later in my timeline is that the Skull and Bones prophet and the Jesuit Pope have a 33-minute meeting, right? 33-minute meeting. And that's literally in the paper. So you want to talk about numbers, we can talk about the number 33, right? And so I think what theoretically could have been happening here is that you have the future Pope in Argentina cooperating with the CIA, and you have the future prophet of the Mormon Church also cooperating with the CIA, right? And now we are at the apex of this plan in 2024, where now you have that Skull and Bones prophet and that Jesuit Pope meeting together, and the Pope giving the prophet, and I'm sure it's that order, right? I'm sure that the Pope is in charge of the prophet, not the prophet in charge of the Pope, but the Pope blessing the building of an LDS temple in Rome, Italy, during Russell M. Nelson's time as president of the church. And President Nelson is very open about this in interviews, and he says this is a hinge point in the history of the church, right? But I think theoretically, and like the documents seem to line up with the hypothesis that, I mean, the Pope and the Mormon prophet may have been working with the CIA for a very, very, very long time on Operation Gladio related things.
You know,
right?
I did want to say, like, I mean, I do think, I mean, maybe it's possible this guy, I already forgot his name, that was like, you said was kind of like working with the CIA. It's like, how do you know he already was in CIA?
Yeah,
and
David Kennedy.
And he was already inserted into the church just to look like a regular member.
Could be. Yeah, I mean, here's what I know. David Kennedy was born into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is sort of, I mean, it's sort of funny to read this Catholic author's take on it, because he just kind of throws his hands up in the air because he's focused on the Catholics, right? And he kind of says, I don't know why David Kennedy is here. It's really weird that this Mormon is a part of this. So I think that the really appropriate question here is, yeah, like, how did David Kennedy go from being born in Podunk, Utah, to being the president of one of the biggest banks in the United States that was working with the CIA and the Vatican? I think that's a very relevant research question that somebody should probably dig into, right?
Yeah. And another thing to your point, both of y'all's point, and Dana brought something up that jogged my memory, and there was mass sterilization happening in Chicago in the late 40s and into the 50s, and sometimes all the way into the 70s. And there was mainly minorities, women, or what have you. Not the point, but with those doctors themselves, because we start to talk about eugenics and what have you, around the same time period, late 40s, mid 50s, you're having mass human experimental trials of birth control happening in Puerto Rico, as well as Central America and some in South America.
Yeah.
So I don't know if all that's connected, but I will say that Puerto Rico and most of Latin America is heavily Catholic. And so if you have these connections, and then now you have the connections with Mormonism, you have Gladio, and then now you're having the other operation happening in Argentina, I would assume that somehow at some point elbows may have been rubbed.
Yeah. So I want you to hold on to that. And at the very end, I want you to remind me of this, because I have a quote that I think is going to explain this pretty much perfectly. Okay. So hang on to that one, because I think you're right on. And I have a quote from a former CIA director that I think is going to kind of prove out what you're saying. Okay. Let's keep moving here. So again, remember, the topic of today is the fact that Russell M. Nelson claims that there are 15 men on the face of this earth that you can trust completely. And we're going through his life to observe his behaviors and the behaviors of those people who are closely associated with him and affiliated with him, including David Kennedy. You can find a talk by Russell Nelson where he openly acknowledges that he learned a lot from David Kennedy. Okay. So it's not like 6 degrees of separation. Russell Nelson worked very closely with David Kennedy, very, very closely. Okay. In addition to David Kennedy, you end up having sexual predators advising prophets, and prophets paying sexual predators, or alleged sexual predators in this case, millions and millions of dollars to give the church advice. So Gordon Bowen is somebody that we've talked about a little bit in other interviews that I've done with you guys. But what I want to show you here is that you've got Gordon Bowen, Russell Ballard, David Haight, and so what did I say? It's Gordon Bowen, Russell Nelson, David Haight, James Faust, all a part of this special affairs committee, right? And the thing that everybody needs to understand, oh, and I see Richard Worthland's name there, which, remember, Richard Worthland is Dick Worthland, who was number 3 in Reagan's administration, right? So we're not talking about just your average Mormon here. This is an elite group of people forming a committee inside the church and being advised by experts like Gordon Bowen. Gordon Bowen is a twice accused sexual predator, including his own stepchildren. Okay. And then in the Hamblin ritual abuse case, Gordon Bowen is listed in those court documents as a sexual predator and a Satanist. Okay. The leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have had a 40-year relationship with Gordon Bowen. Okay. Up to and including Gordon Bowen writing a letter to Gordon B. Hinckley, the prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and asking him to marry him and a woman by the name of Barbara Timothy in the temple. Okay. That marriage is the one that ended up with Gordon Bowen allegedly abusing his children. Okay. And we have the court documents that talk about that. Gordon Hinckley, instead of marrying Gordon Bowen, gave that task to James Faust. And on the very day that Gordon Bowen got married in the Salt Lake Temple, Gordon Hinckley read what was called the Proclamation to the Family, which is the closest thing to LDS scripture that you're going to get for the last little bit. Okay. In addition to that, Gordon Bowen was working very, very closely with Russell Ballard. So M. Russell Ballard is a known criminal. He got deemed by the SEC multiple times for his behaviors, but he's also related to Hiram Smith. And so he just kind of fails upwards for his entire life. Okay. But one of the major things that he was doing was working with Gordon Bowen, paying him millions of dollars to make a movie about Jesus Christ that's so bad that they won't even let anybody see it anymore. Like, not anymore, ever. Like it is locked away and you're never going to see that movie. Because Gordon Bowen was busy writing pornographic material about Jesus Christ, including, like, I can't remember if he's the stallion and Jesus is mounting him, or if Jesus is the stallion and Gordon is mounting the stallion. But Lynn Packer has done some really amazing work on this that everybody can go on YouTube and just type in Lynn Packer, Gordon Bowen, and watch the video of this relationship between Russell Ballard and Gordon Bowen. This is really important because the other person that Russell Ballard was very close to was Tim Ballard. Okay. The guy who's supposedly fighting against sex trafficking, right? But instead is getting sued for sexually abusing and harassing multiple women. And what people really need to stop and ask themselves is, why are prophets getting advice from predators? And what's going on with this triangle between M. Russell Ballard, Gordon Bowen, and Tim Ballard?
That's really weird.
Was M. Russell Ballard keeping a wall of separation between Gordon Bowen and Tim Ballard? Because here's all I know. If Tim Ballard knew about Gordon Bowen and Russell Ballard, the very first person that Tim Ballard should have been raiding would have been Gordon Bowen. So there's this really weird trifecta that nobody's explored, especially in like mainstream media, that at some point somebody needs to look into what was going on between Tim Ballard, M. Russell Ballard, and Gordon Bowen. And it may be that M. Russell Ballard was keeping a very firm wall of separation there and not letting Tim know about Gordon and not letting Gordon know about Tim. But what we know is that M. Russell Ballard was so close to Tim Ballard that Tim Ballard, to this day, defends M. Russell Ballard and calls him his grandpa and says he was closer to M. Russell Ballard than M. Russell Ballard's own children were in a recent interview. And we know that Russell Ballard has a decades-long relationship with Gordon Bowen. Okay? All right, we're going to stop there with that. But the idea here is simply this. Can you really trust 15 men who take advice from men like Tim Ballard and Gordon Bowen? Like, I'll let everybody make their own decisions there, but I certainly don't.
At least call it into question.
At least have the discussion, right? Mm-hmm. At least have the discussion. And then I would say, at least my leadership style is, if I was a leader of people and they brought these concerns to me, I would openly address it so that people's minds and hearts could get some rest. What LDS Inc. does is excommunicate you, sue you, right? Ruin your life and pretend like you never existed because it's dangerous to the brand. The last thing that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints wants you to know, dear friends, is the nature of the relationship between LDS leaders and Gordon Bowen. That is the last thing they want people talking about. Very bad for the brand, which is ironic because Gordon Bowen is all about brands. He owns an advertising agency, a huge advertising agency. one of the biggest advertising agencies in the world. So ironically, what's bad for the LDS brand is exactly what they're doing. And in order to protect themselves and protect that brand, they refuse to let people see inside and learn about who it is that they're affiliating with, supporting, protecting, and paying. So it is what it is, right? And I'm just Justin Riggs. I have 1,700 followers on Twitter, so there are probably 10 people who know about this, which is fantastic. Let's keep going. So in addition to being part of the Special Affairs Committee, Russell Nelson was also a part of the Strengthening Church Members Committee in early 1990. What you can find is that he must have been part of the group of men asking Bishop Pace for what's called the Pace Memo. The Pace Memo is pretty famous inside of Mormon circles because it's a memorandum that was written by a member of the LDS churches, what they call the presiding bishopric, so really high up in the church. And this Strengthening the Church Members Committee requested Bishop Glenn L. Pace to write them, to do an investigation, and he wrote them a memorandum on the subject of ritualistic child abuse. Okay? Not satanic, right? Not satanic ritual abuse. They wanted him to look into ritualistic child abuse. Now, the really disingenuous thing that the church does about this is anytime anybody brings up the Pace Memo anymore, they yell, "Ma satanic panic," and "they's implanted memories in our children's heads." And they make fun of it, just like the CIA does, right? But the fact is, it was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who was asking Glenn Pace to investigate ritualistic child abuse inside the church. Okay? You can see that they were asking because the very first words of the memorandum are, "pursuant to the committee's request." Who was on the committee? Russell M. Nelson was on the Strengthening the Church Members Committee when the Pace Memo was requested. Okay? This also involves people like Brent Ward, who was like one of the head prosecutors for the entire state of Utah. Inside of the memorandum, you'll see that Brent Ward was providing the church reports about ritualistic child abuse. So the thing that's really frustrating is that the church has done an excellent PR job of pushing this under the rug so that even if you try to talk about it with church members, their eyes glaze over and the programming kicks in and they just go beep, bop, boop, bop, beep. Satanic panic is not real. And you're like, look, I'm not talking about satanic panic. I'm talking about ritualistic child abuse that your church leaders asked your bishop to look into and provide them a report on. And what the report says is it's a problem. What the report says is that there are dozens of victims who are having flashbacks when they go to the temple, and that it could be 3 times more than the people that he interviewed if he didn't limit himself on the time that he spent on this so that he could do his other church business. Okay? What the report says very clearly is that the abuse is happening inside of corporate-owned properties, like temples, church buildings, and that the perpetrators aren't just your everyday Mormon, it's mission presidents and bishops and stake presidents that are committing ritualistic child abuse. So it's incredibly frustrating not to be able to discuss this because the very people who asked for the report have now used all the CIA dirty tricks of conspiracy theories, satanic panic, implanted memories, blah, 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 to make sure that you never talk about it when they're the ones who know. We know that they know because they're the ones who commissioned the report. And yet, because it would be so bad for the brand, they took it and they ran to the Chicago Tribune and they gave a big statement about, while we feel bad for anybody who's abused, we just don't think this is a real problem, right? Which I guess maybe they don't think it's a real problem. Maybe technically what they're saying is true and maybe they can sleep at night. But in reality, there are dozens and dozens and maybe hundreds and hundreds, and who knows now, this was 1990, but a lot of people experiencing ritualistic child abuse that's tied to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Not because I say so, because Glenn Pace says so. And if you don't trust Glenn Pace, then you're not sustaining your leaders and you shouldn't be a member of the church. So the church has really worked itself in a pretzel here. And the only way that they can solve it is through brute force, which is like excommunicating people like me when I bring it up, because they can't have a dispassionate, logical, rational conversation about it because their positions are irrational and illogical. They just don't want people to look because it would hurt the brand.
Right.
And that includes Russell Nelson, who was on the committee asking for this report to be made. and had a daughter named in one of these abuse cases. Okay.
So sad.
So we also know that Russell Nelson was on the Strengthening the Church Members Committee. This is just a link to a newspaper article that talks about how Russell Nelson and James Faust were on the Strengthening the Church Members Committee in the 1990s. Okay. Okay. I know we're getting close to time here. Let me just kind of wrap things up. This is important for several reasons. Okay. Bill Carstensen, the diagnosed pedophile that Russell M. Nelson told church leaders not to discipline, ended up marrying a woman by the name of Marilyn Brady. Marilyn Brady worked for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the membership department. And after Bill Carstensen was caught abusing his first family's children, he approached Marilyn Brady and asked her to marry him. Marilyn was warned that he was a pedophile by the ex-wife of Bill Carstensen, but because the church hadn't done any discipline towards Bill Carstensen, Marilyn Brady put her trust in men like Russell Nelson and married Bill Carstensen because he hadn't been disciplined by the church, despite the fact that he was a diagnosed pedophile who has lost lawsuits to the Smith children about the abuse that he committed against them. But because she trusted Russell M. Nelson and men like him, she married a diagnosed pedophile who ended up abusing several other children, including a child that they had by the name of Justin Hoyman. Okay. So Justin Hoyman, you can Google his name and look it up. He disappeared from Salt Lake City in November of 2017. What's not widely known is that Justin Hoyman is actually Justin Carstensen. His father is Bill Carstensen. His full name is Justin William Hoyman. William Carstensen, William Joseph Carstensen, right? And this is really easily established through the public record. Okay. There are court documents and there are interviews with the family where all the children, all their initials line up, their ages line up. Like Justin Hoyman is Justin Carstensen. And he disappeared from Salt Lake City in 2017. And there would be no Justin Hoyman disappearance if Marilyn Brady hadn't represented or hadn't trusted Russell M. Nelson, who chose not to discipline a diagnosed pedophile after he abused several children in Bountiful, Utah. Okay. We know that he became president. I put a funny little picture here. This is a picture of Skull and Bones members at the University of Utah from a newspaper. This is a picture of the first presidency. It's like a before and after picture, maybe. I'm not really sure. But he became president in 2018. And then he started making radical changes to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So this one is firmly in the persistent rumor bin right now. I don't have any documents, but what I've heard is that this emphasis on not calling Mormons Mormons is really at Gordon Bowen's suggestion, that Gordon Bowen feels that the name Mormon isn't good for the brand. And so he encouraged Russell Nelson to come out and talk about it as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So that's just a rumor right now, but it would be another example of prophets taking counsel from alleged pedophiles and predators to the very point of changing the literal identity of every member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right? Since the beginning of the church, we've been known as Mormons. He adjusted a bunch of church policies. He also has been changing what Mormons would consider the eternal ordinances, okay? That would include temple ordinances. So that book that Russell Nelson was talking about to Beverly Bruff Campbell earlier is called Eve and the Mortal Journey. And it is one of the most god-awful books I've ever read in my entire life, full of all kinds of baloney. But look at how Russell Nelson felt about the book that Beverly Campbell wrote. He says, "Dear Beverly and Pierce, faced with the prospects of a long airplane ride to Louisiana and back this past weekend, I took as my companion Beverly's new book, Even the Mortal Journey. I read it from cover to cover and studied it thoroughly. To say that this book was magnificent would be an understatement. It was more than that. It was moving, life-changing, motivating, and inspirational. I love the way you went from chronicling the marvelous experiences of which you were a pivotal part to one of advising people how to find happiness and strengthen their lives." Okay? He goes on and on and on about how great this book is. Well, here's the thing. There have been a lot of changes to the temple ordinance since Russell M. Nelson took over. And almost every one of those changes can be tied to something that Beverly Bruff Campbell wanted in her book, Eve and the Mortal Journey. And I'll leave it up to people to go read even the Mortal Journey, and I'll leave it up to people who go to the temple to tease out what it is that's been changing in the temple. But if you think that it's been changing because Russell M. Nelson is receiving revelation from Jesus Christ, you might be surprised to find out that it's really that he read even the Mortal Journey and just happened to agree with a lot of what Beverly Bruff Campbell and a cadre of academic Mormons believe about the story of Adam and Eve. Okay, because that's what the temple endowment is really about, is the story of Adam and Eve. So let's see, what else do we got? We have Russell M. Nelson meeting with Pope Francis on March 29th, 2019. And like I said, in the newspapers, it's very explicit that it was a how long? 33-minute meeting. Well, okay, that's an oddly specific amount of time, wouldn't you say, Freemason friends, right? But many, many papers note that it was 33 minutes exactly, not 32 and 48 seconds and not 33 and 17 seconds. No, 33 minutes exactly. Okay. He's also meeting with Jacinda Ardern, who was a former Mormon who left the church, but was one of the worst dictators in the world during COVID-19, right? But according to Russell Nelson, he says, it's an unlikely scenario. A young mother leading a great nation, a peacemaker, a policymaker, consensus giver, the church president said at a time. We are very impressed with her. She'll have a great future. So we've got a skull and bones prophet lauding praise on literally one of the worst dictators in the world during COVID-19, who told people that she and her government were the only source of truth, and literally forcing people to get COVID-19 vaccines and threatening their livelihoods. It was one of the worst places in the world to be during that outbreak. And you've got the Mormon skull and bones prophet lauding praise on Jacinda Ardern. Okay. We've talked a lot about Russell Nelson, claiming that in order to be a quote unquote good global citizen, you need to take the COVID vaccine, which is a quote unquote literal godsend. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time about that today. That's just another reason that I don't trust him. Although I think if people want to get vaccinated, that's fine. That's your choice. I just don't think that religious leaders should be using the bully pulpit to try to pressure people into doing it. We know that President Nelson was deeply involved with Ensign Peak, in which LDS Inc. created shell companies and hid assets for like 20 years. And if you read those documents carefully, what you'll see is that it wasn't just the prophet of the church who was approving this. It was the Council on the Disposition of Tithes. And if you trace that a little bit further, what you'll find out is that the Council on the Disposition of Tithes is composed of the entire Quorum of the 12. So there's not a single LDS church leader who did not know and did not approve of what was happening at Ensign Peak. Do not let anybody tell you otherwise, because if they tell you otherwise, they are lying. Okay? Which means that they probably shouldn't be trusted. President Nelson has certainly announced a ton of new temples. What they won't tell you is that those temples are being built by his fraternity brothers, okay? Specifically Oakland Construction, or Auckland, I don't know how to say it, it's Okland. You can go onto their website and you can see that many of these temple construction projects are being given to Sigma Chi and Pi Kappa Alpha construction-owned companies. So he's greasing palms is what he's doing, right? Like they can't even keep the temples full that they have, and yet they're building 200 new ones. And people are very confused about that. Well, you don't have to be confused about it. He's just greasing the palms of his fraternity brethren.
It's called money laundering.
I've heard.
Sorry.
I've heard some things. No. I mean, yeah. So like, I guess I would just shy away from that claim because I just don't have any documentation about it. But there's a good video.
Yes, you're right.
There's a good video out there by Nemo, the Mormon, I think, that talks about like overcharging for air conditioning units and carpet and stuff like that, I think. And so I think there's a potential that could be what's happening, but I just wouldn't make the claim myself personally, right? I mean, and I don't know that you've got to launder a ton of money if you're just enriching your death oath buddies either, but I mean, definitely, I think it's a valid question. And I think somebody who cares about money more than I do should probably look into that. Like, are they laundering money through, because you got to remember, when you build a temple, it's not just the temple. When you announce a temple, all of the real estate around that temple instantly goes way up in value, because every Mormon who trusts these 15 men completely want to buy a house close to the temple, right? So you're not just helping the construction company that builds the temple, you're also helping all of the Mormon real estate agents who are selling the land around the temple. You're also helping, I mean, there's just an entire group of death oath making aristocratic Mormons who are profiting wildly off the behavior of Russell M. Nelson, the death oath making, palm greasing, pedophile protecting prophet, right? And so there's a ton of incentive not to let any of this come out, because if Russell M. Nelson falls, well, it's not just Russell M. Nelson, is it? There's an entire pyramid of people who are benefiting from these 15 men's behavior that are all of a sudden not going to be nearly as comfortable as they're accustomed to being, right? Anyway, so this brings us up to the present. And in 3 days, we have Russell M. Nelson's 100th birthday. They're calling it 99 plus 1. That's their big hashtag on Twitter. I call it 100 minus 1, because the one thing that Russell Nelson's not doing to celebrate his 100th birthday is helping find the kid who is lost because of his behavior. Instead, he's going to be, well, if he's well enough to be at the party, which I think is kind of an open question, like, he's going to be celebrating and receiving adoration and being called beloved prophet by a bunch of people who trust him completely, while Justin Hoyman is missing or dead, right? So I prefer 100 minus 1 instead of 99 plus 1. Because what Russell Nelson should be doing is getting up and saying, look, I made a mistake and there's a kid that's missing or dead, and I have tremendous power and access to tremendous assets, and let's everybody help find Justin, shall we? Can you imagine what would happen if the Mormon prophet got up and acknowledged his part in the Justin Hoyman story and asked Mormons to help find Justin or find out what happened to Justin? And that's well within Russell Nelson's power to do if he wanted to, but he doesn't. And so he'll have a nice birthday party full of adoring fans while Justin Hoyman's family goes to sleep at night wondering what happened to Justin. And that's just the kind of man that Russell Nelson is. And I know that hurts a lot of people's feelings, but as revealed, intent. And Russell Nelson's intent is very, very clear as far as I'm concerned. So what will Russell Nelson's legacy be? I believe personally that, if the world doesn't end here soon, that Russell Nelson and his group of death oath making friends, their legacy will be taking the church down a continual slide from what was supposed to be an eternal organization to a fraternal organization. I think pretty much everything that you can observe from the actions of LDS Inc. shows that they have very little concern about eternal things and spend an inordinate amount of time on fraternal things, right? So here's the final word from me today, because I know we're at a little bit over 2 hours. So this is a quote. It says, considering the importance and all-consuming nature of the work I was doing at the agency, considering the missionary zeal, sense of elitism, and marvelous camaraderie among my colleagues there, one can see how easy it would have been for me to drop out of the world and immerse myself exclusively in the cloak and dagger life. And some of my colleagues at the agency did just that. Socially, as well as professionally, they clicked together, forming a sealed fraternity. They ate at their own favorite restaurants. They partied almost only among themselves. Their families drifted to each other, so their defenses did not always have to be up. In this way, they increasingly separated themselves from the ordinary world and developed a rather skewed view of that world. Their own dedicated double life became the proper norm, and they looked down on the life of the rest of the citizenry. And out of this, an inbred, distorted, elitist view of intelligence that held it to be above the normal processes of society, with its own rationale and justification, beyond the restraints of the Constitution, which applied to everything and everyone else. So this quote is from a former director of the Central Intelligence Agency by the name of Colby. But what I would propose is that I could not draft a more perfect quote to explain the life of Russell M. Nelson than this quote. And I'm just going to read it one more time and then I'll be quiet. But instead of thinking of it as the agency, just replace the church with the agency, okay? Considering the importance and all-consuming nature of the work I, Russell M. Nelson, was doing at the church, considering the missionary zeal, sense of elitism, and marvelous camaraderie among my colleagues there, one can see how easy it would have been for me to drop out of the world and immerse myself exclusively in the cloak and dagger life of Skull and Bones and Sigma Chi. Some of my colleagues at the church did just that, which we know that they did. Socially as well as professionally, they clicked together, forming a sealed fraternity, which is what I would propose that the Mormon aristocracy is. It's a sealed fraternity. It's a small club, and you're not part of it, right? They ate at their own favorite restaurants. We know about the Rocco Siciliano's father, who owned an Italian restaurant in Salt Lake City where the Bennetts loved to eat and bring their friends to eat at. They partied almost only among themselves. We know about Sigma Chi parties in Salt Lake City because M. Russell Ballard was attending them, and we have the children of the people who were at these parties telling us about those parties, right? Their families drifted to each other, so their defenses did not always have to be up. If you want to see intermarrying between families, Mormonism is the place to be, okay? In this way, they increasingly separated themselves from the ordinary church members and developed a rather skewed view of Mormonism, I would say. Their own dedicated double life, which is exactly what I think Russell Nelson lived, a double life, ambivalent about his death oaths and his covenants with God, okay? But their own dedicated double life became the proper norm, and they looked down on the life of the rest of the citizenry or the members of the church. And out of this, an inbred, which is like probably more literally true than we want it to be inside of Mormonism, okay? Out of this, an inbred, distorted, elitist view of intelligence that held it to be above the normal processes of society, okay? Which again, I could go through a dozen examples. So let me just give you one. Beverly Bruff Campbell's daughter, Heather, died in a car accident before she was married. But because Beverly Bruff Campbell and R. Bruff Campbell were important and they were part of this sealed fraternity, they petitioned the church to have their daughter sealed to a man in the temple, and were given special dispensation to do that. And there are dozens and dozens of examples of this sealed fraternity of Mormon aristocrats going outside of normal church policy to give themselves favors to themselves and those who are inside that sealed fraternity. Okay, so this quote couldn't describe that any better than it does. With its own rationale and its own justification, and I'm sure that these men all feel justified, and women all feel justified in their decisions, beyond the restraints of the Constitution. So in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Constitution is called the Doctrine and Covenants. But these men don't follow the Doctrine and Covenants, including the part of the Doctrine and Covenants that tells them that they should be talking to me publicly and privately. Instead, they cower in ivory towers in Salt Lake City and ignore their Constitution because they're part of a sealed fraternity that looks down upon people like me, and they feel like I'm not important enough to talk to. And that's okay. It is what it is, right? Which applied to everything. The Constitution, the Doctrine and Covenants, applies to everything and everyone else, but not to Russell Nelson and not to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and not to the general authorities, because they're a part of a special group of people that don't have to follow the Constitution of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So to end, I would just simply go back to the beginning. Russell M. Nelson claims that there are 15 men that you can trust completely. I would propose that after watching this, you would be hard-pressed to accept him at his words at face value. And I would really encourage every person who is considering trusting these men completely to be very, very careful about whom it is you choose to place your trust in. I, for one, will not be placing my trust in any man on the face of this earth because I am a man and I know that we can't be trusted. So I'm going to choose to put my trust in Jesus Christ, and we'll see how it all shakes out in the end. Any questions or?
I have a quick insert. You spoke of a woman that wrote a book about Eve, right?
Yeah, Beverly Bruff Campbell. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's an association, what you were saying, it reminded me of the book, The Story of Adam and Eve, or Adam and Eve's Story, or something like that it's called. And okay. I read it and because I was curious. And what's interesting in there is it talks about Adam and Eve's story, and it talks about how Eve was Adam's daughter. And it sounds a little bit similar of this, like what you talk about, like this deviation from the norm or deviation from the standard story that we've all heard growing up as children. But what I found interesting is that this woman writes a book about, an alternative view to the Adam and Eve story. And the Adam and Eve story that I read was actually from the CIA website. And so all of a sudden you start to see like, wow, is this something they're trying to insert into the zeitgeist? And the way that I heard about it was because it was all the rave through a Joe Rogan podcast and how they're kind of pushing that whole thing. And so, you know, we know through other people that, you know, the whole Esalen Institute, Stanford Institute, and all these, you know, think tanks, how they try to insert these ideas from these think tanks into the people's zeitgeist. And you see all these CIA connections. And then we talked about how some of these people in the Mormon church are affiliated with CIA. And so you see almost this, again, recycling of same playbook tactics.
Yeah.
So I thought I would just insert that.
Yeah, that's great. Well, so, I mean, I don't know if you know, but Mormons are involved with Esalen. So David Levitt, who's in the Hamblin abuse case, his wife is Esalen. Shalom Levitt is a sex therapist associated with Esalen, right? Yes. I mean, I guess if
and
I
the author,
one
more thing, the author, I think it's a pen name, but the author is a proclaimed UFOologist. And again, we go back to the whole UFO thing. And so it seems like it's all so tied in. So, yeah.
So let's go conspiracy theorist for the end here, just for the fun of it.
Okay.
This is not my theory. This is actually the theory of a friend who I'm not going to name because he's actually pretty prominent at this point. But I had dinner with this friend a while back, and his claim is that this group of elitist occult men who have been running the show for quite a while, which I think would include a lot of the people that we've been talking about today, the Vatican, the Mormon leadership, the Central Intelligence Agency, so on and so forth. The reason that we're getting so much UFO disclosure right now is that the setup for religious people is going to be that the Antichrist is going to be an alien, a humanoid alien life form who has powers beyond our ability to comprehend. Again, not my theory of a friend. But when he told me that, I had to honestly stop and think, based on my religious beliefs, what other kind of being is going to get our attention in the way that my religious texts teach me, right?
Yes.
And so I would certainly caution and counsel everybody out there to be very, very careful about who they throw their support behind. Right. You know, as we get closer and closer to the government revealing, because they just love us so much, right? Yeah. The true nature of extraterrestrial contact. I'd be very careful about who you end up following and who you end up, I don't know, taking the mark of, I guess, if you want to put it that way, right? And what societies you choose to participate in and with. And I mean, I would certainly say, like, you better be well rooted in what it is you believe in, who it is you're going to follow, because there's a lot of deception out there right now, isn't there?
I would agree.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Very well said.
Yes. All right. Justin, is that it with the presentation?
Well, I've been going for 2 hours and 15 minutes, so I think if nobody else's butt is sore, mine is definitely sore, so I should probably wrap it up for today, I think. But
it was very thorough.
Yes,
it was very thorough.
Yes, that was really good, man. I really enjoyed that one. Thank you very much. Yeah, and Lisa, thank you too. You contributed a lot, some great questions. I appreciate it. Do you want to plug your Twitter account there, Justin?
Yep, at LDS Abuse. Let me just take one more minute. I'm going to be making a little bit of a transition. Like, it's a lot of fun to poke the giant in the eye and kick him in the shins, but it's also kind of a Promethean task, right? And it takes a lot out of you to do this kind of work. And so, like, while I'm not going to stop doing it altogether, if you'll indulge me, here's how I look at it. What the world really needs right now is a little bit of a mindset reset, right? Like, we have been abused and used by people for generations now. And what I would really like to start working on is helping people understand that despite the fact that we are under the thumb of some really nasty people, that you don't have to suffer. And, like, I'm a personal witness to this because I've been through a lot of really tough situations in the last few years. And the greatest secret that I learned, your show's called The Occult Rejects, right? And occultism is all about secrets, right? Mm-hmm. Well, let me tell you what I think the greatest secret is here. The greatest secret is it doesn't matter how nasty they are, and it doesn't matter how devious they are, and it doesn't matter what their plans are. We don't have to suffer because of their poor decisions, and it's all about your mindset. So I'm going to be shifting a little bit more on my LDS Abuse Twitter site to trying to work with people to shift our mindset to less victimhood and more empowerment in terms of, like, we're going to always talk about the abuse and we're going to acknowledge that it happened, but we're not going to get stuck spending our lives finding every wrong thing that they did, because there's just too many things. They're really bad people who spent their entire lives doing really immoral, unethical, and illegal things. We could spend our entire lives digging this out, but it's just not a good use of our time. So yeah, so if people are into that and they want to follow over at LDS Abuse, and we want to shift away from kicking people in the shins and poking them in the eye to try to be a little bit more empowered in our own lives, then I'd love for you to come and follow me. That'd be great.
I love that. That was great, man. That was perfect ending. Yes. Yeah, I guess that's the end of another Occult Rejects. I really appreciate it, man. Thank you, everybody in the chat. I appreciate it. It was a long one, but I think that was really tons and tons of information. And this is why I love having this man on again. Maybe one day in the future, he'll come back on too. Thank you all. And until the next one, everybody be well. Later.